So Jeff Tumlin, who I've known for a while, I'll introduce in a second, is going to give us we're going to step back now and really take a sort of a national snapshot. Jeff's going to walk us through a lot of his work that's both national but really is grounded in places and helping a lot of communities around the country. After Jeff, we're going to bring up really a local panel. We've got some great experts on that panel, and they're going to really talk about their perspective on making those connections between transportation and health. And I'm going to moderate and facilitate that. As I said, we'll have a little break from 3 to 3:15. Then we're going to bring up Dave Vaughton, who's with us here from the San Francisco Bay Area Metropolitan Transportation Commission, MTC. And Dave has been fabulous in terms of, he was the person down in the San Francisco region that really ran all the quantitative analysis on their projects and their selection in their long-range plan the last couple of years. So he's going to tell a little bit of that story. Jeff Hobson over here, who is with Transform, an advocacy organization also based in the Bay Area, is going to also fill in a little bit of that. And then we're going to end the day on breakout sessions. So we're going to tell you a little bit more about how that's going to work. But again, we realize we have a lot of speakers with a pretty tight agenda. I'm going to try to get questions in from the audience, but really those breakout sessions are really your opportunity and your chance to actually digest what you hear today and to feed it back. We've got some nice group of facilitators. Any questions on the agenda? Then we're all done at 5. Any questions about why you're here? Okay, good. Don't ask them if you have those. Okay, I want to introduce Jeff Tumlin. I've known Jeff for a long time. We were not going to say how long because we both look so incredibly young, you wouldn't believe. But Jeff really has had a remarkable history, and what I so appreciate about Jeff is he's got lots of practitioner experience. He's been inside institutions and agencies. He now serves at Nygaard, which, other than Parsons Brinckerhoff, is one of the, I think, the more savvy consulting firms in the country, and I do mean that. They do fabulous work. Jeff directs a lot. He's a principal there, directs a lot of their strategy. He also co-authored the NACTO Street Design Manual, which if you have not seen that, it's a great bedside reading. Highly recommended. But again, in terms of actually changing the state of practice, that is a really, who knows what the NACTO, there we go. We didn't even rehearse that. Who knows what the NACTO Street Design Guideline? Okay, great, fabulous. Because again, I think we're in this era now. We're really just beginning, and I've been in this field for a while. We've been talking about this for a long time, but we're seeing this explosion in interest in how do we actually do something differently. And frankly, too, it's an interest not just how we do it differently. How do we get co-benefits? But frankly, how do we do it more effectively and even save money while we're doing it, right? So I think if we can win on this, it's a remarkable way to actually save money and get better outcomes. So turn it over to Jeff. Right. Sorry?
What's NACTO?
You don't know what NACTO is?
I hear people around me wondering, what's NACTO?
All right, okay. A quarter every time I use an acronym. The National Association of City Transportation Officials. NACTO. NACTO. Yeah. All right. You'll be joining them, I know, this afternoon.
It's also a new fried snack. In the spirit of true confessions, as James already gave us this morning, I actually have 2 confessions to make. First is my role in writing the National Association of City Transportation Officials Urban Street Design Guide was actually very small. It was done by my colleagues, but it is something I'm very familiar with. But really more troublingly, the major confession that I need to make in full disclosure this morning is not only am I from San Francisco, but I was born in Los Angeles. I was born in Los Angeles, and I own a car, and I actually love driving my car. And in fact, like all little boys growing up everywhere, and particularly those of us growing up in Los Angeles, I had a fixation with transportation from a very, very early age that really covered all modes of transportation, from my tricycle to imaginary trains that I've never actually seen except on TV, to the cars that I experienced every day. And I did watch a lot of TV. And TV taught me so many things. Among the things that TV taught me was that someday owning my own car would be the most awesome thing that I could possibly do to bring me freedom power, adventure, autonomy, and someday, in fact, sex, right? This was what the automobile industry has spent billions of dollars every year training us to believe, and I completely bought it. In fact, my love affair with the automobile continued in my first job, which was at Disneyland. Growing up in Southern California, classic Southern California childhood, and one of the most popular rides at Disneyland remains to this day one of the only rides at Disneyland that remains unchanged since the park opened in 1955, which is the Autopia ride, which imagined really the interstate highway system. But what it was really imagining was how our lives would be transformed if we actually built out the vision that was promulgated by the Futurama exhibit at the 1933, 39, and 64 World's Fairs. The Futurama exhibit remains the most visited industrial exhibit in the history of the world. In the 1939 World's Fair, in the midst of the Great Depression, 1/3 of the population of the United States visited the World's Fair and saw this exhibit that promised us a future utterly transformed through the ownership of an automobile and the retooling of our cities to accommodate them. And it was a beautiful vision. It was a compelling vision, particularly at that time when cities were not doing well and they were crowded and filthy and not very, healthy places to be. The automobile was truly going to deliver us a better future. And indeed, this country, believing in that future, invested a phenomenal amount of resource in building it out. And indeed, I would argue that the interstate freeway system was one of the wisest investments this country made and unleashed tremendous economic power in this far-flung, disparate, almost impossible to kind of group together country. But we made some terrible mistakes, including building freeways through urban neighborhoods, but also believing that freeways would eliminate our congestion problem. And so, nonetheless, we continue, every time we go out for a tax measure, to ask for more money to build more of this stuff. We continue to tell voters, oh, really, just one more traffic lane, we promise. Just one more lane, and we'll finally deliver on that promise of easy motoring mobility that's going to deliver us freedom, autonomy, social status, and sex. So is it any wonder why Americans are increasingly irritated about both our transportation system as well as our government's ability to follow through on its promises? And so we continue in our frustration to pound our fist on the table and to demand that something must be done. Like, I don't know what, just give me another traffic lane so I don't have to be stuck in this horrific congestion. Not, however, necessarily thinking about all of the consequences of our actions. And indeed, as this presentation will get into a little bit more, the limitations on the human brain are one of the fundamental flaws at the root of the flaws of our transportation system. How many of you like to eat ice cream? I like ice cream. How many of you have seen children enjoy ice cream, right? If it were a social priority to make children happy, shouldn't we demand that all ice cream be free for children, right? This is a great public policy. Of course ice cream should be free for children. In fact, if ice cream were free for children, I mean, of course we might have, radically increased price for cheese, and our forests would be being bulldozed for cattle farms and so on. But damn it, if you decided to advocate the elimination of free ice cream for children, clearly you would hate children, right? So thinking through the consequences of our actions is not something that we as humans are particularly skilled at. In the small business world, I mean, I might theorize that my junior staff people would work harder, if I beat them, right? And that might work maybe for the first couple of days, but then my employees would start to realize, wait, this is really not working out for me. And that indeed the supply and demand lines of beatings versus morale, they cross at a certain point, and my employees start leaving and they become less productive. In fact, running a small business requires some of the most sophisticated systems thinking that any of us ever have to do. And systems thinking is really the hardest thing that our brains are capable of doing. And it is mostly absent in our approach to transportation planning. In transportation planning, we are primarily object thinkers. Step A happens, then step B, and then it just sort of ends there. You add a traffic lane, you eliminate congestion, done. Great, problem solved. As James also mentioned, while the transportation industry has been really fantastic at developing tools based upon theoretical models, we haven't been the best at actual use of empirical data and testing our model results later. The health industry, I would argue, has been much more sophisticated, at least since the 17th century, in the use of empirical testing of their data. And one of the things that the health industry has been collecting data on since 1985, these are maps the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta have produced, is obesity rates in the United States at the state level, but also at the metropolitan region. So this is 1985. You probably can't see down below, but the blue is 10 to 14% of adults obese. 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, they have to change the scale. 15 to 19% of adults obese in the dark blue. 92, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we change the scale again. Over 20% in the yellow. 2001, now we had to change the scale, 25% in the red. 2011, 2005, we changed the scale, more than 30% in the dark red, and so on, and it just keeps going. And in fact, the data get even worse, but since 2010, the data that CDC has been producing, they changed their color schemes so that it doesn't work very well in the PowerPoint. And while we recognize in the health industry that correlation is not causation, if you look at the same maps for diabetes and other cardiovascular diseases, the maps show almost exactly the same patterning. And if you match the maps up against rates of walking or rates of driving, the maps show exactly the same patterning, particularly as you bore down from the state level into the metropolitan and finer levels of analysis. In fact, one of the things that the health industry has concluded overwhelmingly is that the human body, we are nomadic creatures of the savanna, and the human body is designed to be optimal with a lot of walking, about 10,000 steps a day. And if we don't get our 10,000 steps a day built in to our daily lives, not having to drive to a gym and do this on a treadmill, if we don't have walking built into our daily lives, our bodies are not functioning optimally, and they start to fall apart in very expensive ways. But physical health, cardiovascular health, is not the only kind of health where transportation touches the functioning of our bodies. It also affects our mental health, and there are powerful relationships between our mental health and our physical health. This happens in a lot of different ways. My favorite way that this happens is the release of a remarkable neuropeptide called oxytocin. It looks like that. And oxytocin is produced in very, very specific ways and has remarkable effects on the way we view the world. It is effectively the biological basis of social trust. And it is released by the brain in specific circumstances, including looking longingly into the eyes of someone you love. It is released in breastfeeding. It is released in orgasm. It is also released in outdoor exercise, regardless of age or gender or ability. And so we've also experienced this ourselves. We've been with our significant other and been in a horrible argument where you thought, like, this relationship is not going to work, this is horrible, everyone is horrible, and you've gone out for a walk, you've gone out for a bike ride or a run. And while there are many brain chemicals at play, including dopamine and endorphins, those pleasure chemicals in the brain aren't particularly long-lasting. They're basically like a little jolt of morphine. The one that does last and that builds upon itself is oxytocin. Oxytocin doesn't dissipate. The more the brain releases, the more trust it generates. And it is also I would argue one of the reasons that Nate Silver came up with his very famous heuristic, that people vote Republican where there are no sidewalks. On the other hand, I felt that was kind of topical comedy. On the other hand, there's a whole other set of chemicals that the brain releases when we are trapped inside our automobiles. So in addition to being kind of nomadic primates, we are also social, tribal creatures. And our brains are designed to send and receive a tremendous amount of social information at all times, whenever we're with people. Most of this is nonverbal, most of it is not conscious. But you know when you're walking down 3rd Avenue or down a crowded street in Manhattan, you can be walking through a massive crowd of people and not actually run into somebody, even though you don't have blinkers on your belt. And you do this because you're sending a lot of social signals with the positioning of your shoulders, the directionality of your eyes, that you're picking up on unconsciously of the people around you, signaling where you're going to go and so on. There's a set of social rules that we've adapted to for maneuvering in crowds. And even if you were to accidentally bump into somebody, you don't have to turn around and issue a full apology. You just need to shrug your shoulders, put your hands up, tilt your head. There's a whole bunch of gestures that signal submissiveness or apology or even aggression. Like, hey, buddy, what the hell do you think you're doing? You don't have to say it. When we're in our cars, however, all of that social chemistry in our brain is still at play. But at 60 miles an hour, 100 feet away from the nearest person, inside the carapace of glass and steel of your car, somebody may cut you off. And he may not even be aware that he's just cut you off. But he's now both directly threatened your social status and your safety. The most primitive part of your brain, and the amygdala, starts firing the fight or flight response. The first reaction is aggression, alert, and when that gets no response, you up the ante. Your brain automatically does this without having any control. And it starts upping the ante to the point where the full fight or flight response is triggered. Your muscles tense, you're ready to fight, you're ready to flee. And most importantly, the prefrontal cortex of your brain shuts down. Because in fight or flight, you don't have time to think through the consequences of your actions. If the saber-toothed tiger is chasing you, you need to just move or grab a stick and start whacking at it, right? There isn't time to think. This is how our brains have been designed to survive. And so for those of you in the audience who drive, you've also noticed that we have all done the most outrageous, unspeakable, antisocial things behind the wheel of a car than we would ever do in any other aspect of our lives. This is not because you are a bad person. This is your brain chemistry at play. And what happens if you're trapped in your car in this aggressive environment every single day driving to and from work on I-5, it's horrible. What happens is permanent changes in the brain. You become less trustful, more angry, permanently less able to think through the consequences of your actions. And in fact, the health industry now identifies road rage as not a social, but a clinical term, because it is a lasting condition that damages the brain. And so, in addition to excessive driving, taking away from our walking and making us fat and diabetic and unhappy and not getting laid nearly as much as we would like to, we still have transportation policies that fixate on that rather than that or that. And so what do? Well, in most cities, in fact, almost all of my clients have elaborate policy documents that talk about public health and walkability and transit-oriented development and accessibility. And then they very, very carefully think through their zoning code and street design manual and environmental compliance guidelines, all of which require their city traffic engineers and private developers to build this, where if you live there and you want to visit your friend over there, sorry, you can't do that. Similarly, we wonder why we're angry at our traffic engineers when this is what we require that they build. So this is mixed-use development. There's housing, here's some retail, some shopping, I don't know what that is, maybe a hotel, who knows. And look, there's sidewalks and landscaping, and oh, very importantly, there's enough parking. They met the government-mandated minimum parking requirement. That's really critical, because you know that if you're at this store and you want to go to that store, you're going to get in your car and drive across the street. And, well, wait, no, there is a pedestrian there in this environment. So it's still pedestrian-oriented development and clearly meets all of the safety requirements built into the street design manual that required that this place be built. So one of my favorite things to do to torture my clients is to point out the rather stark contrast between their mother and apple pie policies and the codes and regulations that make it illegal to implement any of those policies. And let me just say right now, there is not a single government of any scale anywhere in the United States where it is currently legal to implement their policies. This is ridiculous. In fact, in every city in the country, if your favorite place there were to burn to the ground, it would be illegal to replace it, and illegal according to a dozen different regulations. So what do you do to fix this? It's actually not that hard, but it requires digging into the arcana that most of our, well, transportation in particular, but most of our sister agencies, our sister industries, have worked really, really, really hard to make it impossible for you to understand, including use of lots of acronyms and black box tools and models that seem really smart, but, well, we'll get to that in a second. So step one, and I would argue this is most important, and Robin started alluding to the importance of performance metrics early on. If your policies are not measurable and they're not quantified, they do not exist. You might as well not have them. And one of the first places to start with is looking at how you measure the success of the transportation system. In most cities and regions around the United States, the only performance metric that we use for measuring the success of everything that we ask the transportation system to do is intersection level of service. Intersection level of service is a mathematical calculation that estimates the seconds of delay that an automobile experiences as a result of congestion in the peak 15 minutes of the peak 1 hour. It does not consider overall travel time. It doesn't look at delay that's a result of signal timing. It doesn't look at delay that might happen in the second, most congested hour. It doesn't look at any other mode of transportation. And I would point out that because it is a measure of vehicle delay rather than person delay, the people on board a bus with 50 people on board are valued at 1/50th the value of a person driving alone in a car. So it is a powerful statement of what our societal values are. So level service has also driven us to make all sorts of interesting investments, like the Embarcadero Freeway that famously cut San Francisco off from its waterfront, because we thought that free-flowing traffic was our highest value in the transportation system. And that, these sort of busy, congested streets with lots of stuff going on and, people shopping, that's really, really bad from a transportation perspective. But of course, how one weights level service might vary depending upon your perspective. And so if you're a traffic engineer, the street that's crowded and full of people and stuff happening, that's really bad, level service F, you failed as a traffic engineer. Whereas the street that offers free flow, free movement, and the sidewalks could allow you unimpeded walking, even though there's nothing to walk to, that's the best that you can do. Level service A, gold star on your report card. But of course, if you're an economist, you might view this a little bit differently. If you're an economist, you might say, oh, okay, the street that meets its peak capacity in the peak 15 minutes of the peak 1 hour, what that means is supply and demand have come into perfect balance at the absolute peak of the peak. If I'm an economist and I'm at level of service F, that means that the facility has been perfectly sized to meet the demand. Why would you provide more of a facility than was necessary to meet the demand in the peak hour, on the peak day? right? And indeed, if I'm an economist, what I want to see is the productive use of these facilities. The street that is crowded with people and cars is a street that's delivering high value. In fact, if I'm a retailer, level service F is far better than level service A. Level service E might be optimal, but level service A, B, C, and D, no, that's terrible for business. Cars are driving too fast, and there aren't enough of them. So, one of the things that we've noticed as more and more cities have started rethinking their transportation performance metrics is when you start looking at many different metrics, it allows your decision makers to make better decisions, reflecting a whole array of values. I'm not saying that we need to eliminate level of service, although the state of California is in the process of making level of service illegal as a transportation analysis criterion for environmental analysis. We're expecting that to be finalized probably early next year. We will no longer be able to use level of service at all. Nonetheless, it is a useful measure for a variety of purposes, but it needs to be put in its place. We need to be able to compare the social value of accessible driving, of easy motoring, against social values such as equity or public health or economic development or safety. So indeed, during the Bloomberg administration, Jeanette Sadeghan did a fantastic work called Measuring the Street, where she went out with her crews and redid a whole bunch of streets in New York on a pilot basis, and then measured how the streets performed under a variety of different criteria afterwards, including eliminating traffic lanes on congested streets, noticing that safety improved dramatically, and retail response improved dramatically, and indeed, by a subjective measure of asking people whether they liked it or not, she was still able to quantify that, yes, indeed, 74% of people surveyed said, this is so much better, please let's do more of this. Transportation data, including factors like level of service, are fundamentally subjective, and that's okay. We care about whether people like the way that government is investing our taxpayer dollar, but it's important to quantify that. Similarly, in places where New York eliminated parking spaces in order to create public plazas and outdoor seating, 172% increase in retail sales in the stores adjacent to the new parks and plazas, 77% increase in seated pedestrians, and this one a 14% increase in sales. These are good reasons to eliminate parking spaces, even though, in fact, parking supply and parking availability are also social goods, but social goods to be kept in balance with other objectives. So once we've got the right performance metrics to make sure that everything that we're asking the transportation system to do is properly reflected in the way we're measuring the transportation system's success, then you need to make sure that you've got the right tools for being able to predict which investments are going to provide the highest return on investment. George Box, who's really one of the foundational thinkers in the world of travel demand modeling, very famously said, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. Models are useful to the extent that you understand how they work. In terms of trying to use them to predict the future, they are really no better than tarot cards. But they can be extraordinarily effective if you understand their strengths and their weaknesses, and you use them effectively to compare alternatives against each other in order to produce predictive information about the performance metrics that matter. Models are incredibly important, but you need to design them to be able to answer the questions that really matter to you. One of the things that models are notoriously bad at is understanding our insatiable desire for mobility. None of us likes sitting congestion. I hate sitting in congestion. In fact, even I complain about congestion and want somebody to do something about it. And many of us will complain to our local transportation department and demand that the roadway get widened in order to alleviate congestion. And so money gets spent, and that happens, and that makes us happier, right? That's great. So now we're happy, and now like, oh, hey, honey, that new restaurant that opened across town, why don't we go try it? Because it's faster to drive there. We wouldn't have gone there before because it was always too congested, but now we can. Or better yet, honey, what do you think about moving to the bigger, cheaper house farther away? Because now that the highway has been widened, we can still both get to our jobs. And so making us happier about faster driving actually has an impact on our behavior. And it means we drive more, which results in congestion, which makes us unhappy again, which means that we demand that roadways get widened and then driving gets faster for about 5 minutes. And we perpetuate this cycle. This is not working for us very well at all, and yet we still are trapped in it. If our models don't accommodate human psychology and the way we change behavior based upon how the transportation system works, then the models are indeed going to do a very bad job of predicting the future. Similarly, if the models assume that all young people will drive like their parents, they're also not going to do a very good job of predicting the future. Indeed, my generation was the last generation that actually believed it when the car commercials told us that driving a car is going to get me freedom, autonomy, social status, and sex. For younger people today, there is something that gets them all that, and that's one of these. And the only thing that takes them away from this, what is the thing that makes them not be able to use this? It's driving a car. And so while young people indeed, are driving, they're driving with a radically different attitude. They're looking at the car as a tool that you have to use only because the land uses were laid out stupidly and I have no other reasonable option to get where I need to go unless I get in a car. If it is at all reasonable to make another modal choice, young people are enthusiastically doing that with a very different attitude than older generations. And the result of that is that per capita vehicle miles traveled has been in freefall since 2005. Now, we expected this part of the curve as a result of the recession. What is amazing is that across all ages and all income levels, per capita VMT is still dropping despite the recovery. What this suggests is something that is putting the automobile industry into a complete panic, which is that our attitude about the car and our thinking that it is an extension of our personal identity is completely broken. It is nothing more than a tool, and our models need to start reflecting this attitudinal difference. And indeed, survey after survey confirms this. The piece of technology you'd be most unwilling to give up. Yes, mobile device. Yes, I don't, want to drive, on and on and on. And yet, again, our rhetoric around transportation investments remains rooted in this sort of mid-50s, do you want to be stuck in congestion or do you want free-flowing driving? Yes, let's widen our roads. Instead of asking, what kind of a place do you want to live in? What kind of a life do you want to lead? How do you want your children to be able to get to school? How many jobs do you want access to within a 20-minute commute from your home? There are lots of different questions you should be asking, including a much more fundamental question that all of our travel demand models need to be able to tell us, which is not how many cars does the transportation system move, but rather how well does it move people and goods. Because ultimately, we all have a lot of flexibility in the choices that we make, some of them more elastic than others. But the transportation system really needs to deliver on its promise of regional prosperity, accommodating economic vitality, providing the same opportunities for people of all ages, incomes, abilities, and ethnicities and genders, and securing our fantastic quality of life in this stunningly beautiful and rich environment. Point number 3, once you've got the sort of wonkish performance metrics and tools taken care of, is to start actually making the transportation system work. And the foundation of any transportation system is not the rail system or the roads or the highways. The foundation is walking. Every single mode of transportation is dependent upon a good walking network. And this includes driving. Cities like Seattle don't work for motorists unless motorists feel they can park their car and walk a couple blocks to their destination. Similarly, transit utterly dependent upon pedestrian access to transit stations. And this doesn't just mean making the pedestrian system, like making the sidewalks physically connected. It also means making the pedestrian experience delightful, making it compelling. Indeed, we have to appeal to our innate desire, our craving for places that are beautiful, sociable, and interesting, places that are engaging. We are social tribal primates, and we love environments like this. Americans spend thousands and thousands of dollars flying far away just for the opportunity to experience places like this. You can build them here in Seattle. You're already doing that. You should be doing that throughout the region. There is no excuse ever for compromising the delightfulness of the pedestrian environment in order to better accommodate any mode of transportation, including improving the performance of the transit system. The fourth point, once you've got the walking system nailed down, is to recognize that bicycling is also important, but it is important that you appeal to cyclists of all ages and abilities if you want biking to be treated seriously and if you want it to be a well-used alternative to other modes of transportation. Indeed, one of the things that we're finding all over the United States is that as market preferences are shifting in terms of what younger people, younger families, as well as aging baby boomers are looking for in their housing, lower density places that aren't within easy walking distance of retail and transit are suffering, and their salvation is going to depend upon retrofitting them in order to make them bikeable. Because even in the lowest density suburban locations that are currently highly automobile dependent, the bike is like, it's the super walking, right? You can dramatically expand where you can get to if the quality of the environment is there. And that means appealing to cyclists like this. And indeed, the other thing that is being found universally across regions is that the best thing that we can do to make cycling safer is to get more cyclists out there. So I think John Forrester and others are sort of kind of correct that dedicated cycle tracks and other dedicated bike facilities in and of themselves aren't particularly extra safe. But they create the perception of safety such that they attract significant numbers of riders, which in turn results in dramatically improved safety results. This is data from Portland showing the crash rate in that city crashing dramatically as the rate of cycling increased. So again, appealing to this broad segment in the middle, the sort of 60% of Americans who would really, really like to bicycle, but are currently uncomfortable doing so because of our lack of bike infrastructure. These are people who will bike everywhere on vacation, you know, when they're in Holland or Germany, but are terrified to bike in the United States. And indeed, again, going to New York, the data is compelling. Not only do you get more cyclists if you build good facilities, you also get more local spending. Because guess what? It's really easy to hop off your bike and go into a local store. It's a lot more convenient because you don't have to find a parking space. And it's also a lot easier to shop locally, even if it's slightly more expensive than going out to the superstore at the edge of town. Biking equals retail spending. Point 5, make transit fast, frequent, reliable, and very importantly, dignified. This is something that the French are masters of, recognizing again that if this is the thing that's getting me freedom, autonomy, social status, and sex, making transit sociable also results in significantly enhanced ridership. I think this is a tram, but their buses look exactly like this as well. Floor-to-ceiling transparent glass, no buses wrapped in advertising. You can see all the way through this tram and through the adjacent one and see the storefront across the street. And guess what? You can see the attractive person sitting there flirting with you as you're walking past. And so taking transit actually becomes part of the urban promenade experience. And again, the data is compelling. You make transit high quality, you make it faster and more reliable, people take it in droves. We've already mentioned the National Association of City Transportation Officials Urban Street Design Guide that I am not the co-author of, but my colleagues did. Critically important to adopt the right street design manual for urban streets. almost all cities in the United States have local street design manuals that are rooted in the science of rural highway engineering. This is the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials policy on the geometric design of streets and roads, as well as the various state highway design manuals. Some of the best engineering that has ever been written in the history of the world, but the principles that make streets safe in urban environments are the opposite of the principles that make streets safe in a rural highway environment, where accommodating driver error, through wider lanes and more sweeping curves and shoulders and so on, works well when there are no pedestrians present and you're out on the middle of a rural road. In an urban environment, elevating the perception of danger in order to get motorists to actually pay attention, to use their peripheral vision and not just their focused vision, and to accommodate a large degree of chaos results in dramatically better safety results. You need to change your design manual so that good, safe urban design is done as the primary design approach and not as it is typically done now, which is as an exception. Point number 7, and we're almost done there, 8, is one of my favorite topics. A lot of people will come and make me talk about this, which is parking. And one of the easiest things to solve, and yet is the place where Americans suffer the most cognitive dissonance, is parking. It makes us all really, really stupid. And I haven't quite figured out the psychology of this. But firstly, we need to remember that the reason we charge for parking is the reason we charge for any other good or service in our society. It is to bring supply and demand into balance. We live in a market economy, and yet in the transportation world, we have the only two goods, roads and parking, by which we use the Soviet communist method of balancing supply and demand. So step 1 is recognizing why we charge for parking. Step 2 is then recognizing, okay, if parking is an extension of our business strategy, any business on Main Street that only accepted business in quarters would soon go out of business. So all parking meters need to accept credit cards and debit cards. It boggles me when I see a parking meter that takes quarters. How do these exist still? It's amazing. They're more expensive to maintain. You should also recognize that in all cities, you have tens of thousands of parking spaces that sit empty, even when you have people complaining that there's no parking because they can't find them. It is always cheaper to use technology to help your customers or your employees find those thousands of empty spaces than it is to demand that new spaces be built at $30,000 a piece. Point number 3. If the reason we charge for parking is to bring supply and demand into balance, the right price for parking is, again, the same as any other good or service in our society. The right price for parking is the lowest price that achieves an availability target. The right price for parking is the lowest price that makes sure that you've got about 15% of spaces empty in every parking lot, in every parking garage, and on every block face. If you charge more than that, you'll have too many empty parking spaces and people will yell at you and you won't make very much money. If you charge less than that, all of your parking spaces will be full, people will drive around in circles and they will complain and you'll make less money. The right price for parking is always the lowest price that meets about a 15% availability target. And this is something that San Francisco has worked on for a long time, and that Seattle has been rapidly expanding in terms of its parking policies. Again, if your task is to achieve availability, the other thing that you need to do is to charge during the right time. So if you've got an evening entertainment district, you can charge until midnight on Friday and Saturday. And by the way, it doesn't say anywhere in Leviticus that parking has to be free on Sunday. Parking is free on Sunday because most cities haven't changed their parking policies since 1958, when stores were closed on Sundays. Think about where the money goes when you raise parking, because people will still think that you're evil, money-grabbing bastards for demanding that they pay for parking. Unbundle your parking and share it. Never force renters to rent more parking than they need. Bad policy. and then pull it all together with what we call a park once district. So if you've got a big ugly arterial and a bunch of land uses and parking lots, and you think of a typical trip where you drive your daughter to school, and that you park there and you park at work, and then you have to take her to soccer practice, and then you go do some shopping, and you pick her up and you go home. It's a lot of traffic, a lot of turning movements, big mess. If instead you have the same land uses, but array them on little streets, and you share the parking, you can have the same trip where you park once, and your daughter walks herself to school while you go to work, and now she can get herself to soccer practice, and you can pick up shopping, and then you can go home. This is the exact same trip as the previous one, but dramatically different results, just because of the way we've managed parking. Half the parking, half the land area, quarter of the arterial trips, a sixth of the arterial turning movements, less than a quarter of the vehicle miles traveled, or twice as much economic development potential at half the traffic. Much smarter. Finally, I'd like to leave you with a challenge. One of the reasons why we suffer in the transportation and urban planning world is that we're still stuck in a Jetsons vision of the future of the city. We are still looking to the 1933 World's Fair Futurama exhibit, sponsored by General Motors, as our guide to the city of the future. So the challenge for you is to think about what really matters to you, what would make you happy, what would make you healthy, and how do we design a set of policies, performance metrics, codes, regulations, and design standards in order to build to that far more beautiful, more compelling vision of the city of the future. And with that, I think we need to move on.